In May 2023, I travelled to Alaska. This trip was actually in two parts: a cruise from Vancouver to Seward, and then an independent land adventure to Denali National Park and back. This video shows how I planned my land adventure, and a companion video has been released at the same time showing how I planned my cruise. So let's get started. This video is a bit long, but I've titled everything, but obviously I hope you watch the full thing. My biggest lesson from planning my Alaska land adventure is that, it's that Alaska is massive. You know it's massive, and then you don't fully appreciate how massive it is until you're planning a trip. It's the biggest state in the US. It's over twice as large as Texas, and is larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. You understand this in the abstract, but it doesn't fully hit home until you try and plan things to do within a week or so. Some people spend 3+ months roaming around the state in a camper van and still don't feel they've penetrated it. So you don't stand a frickin' chance. You have to accept that your adventure will be a series of epic compromises. And at first, this can be quite frustrating. It can feel quite disappointing. And I definitely went through that phase, right? You're trying to cram in as much as possible as you can. You realise it's not possible unless you can live the same period of time twice. And you do back away from it and think, okay, how's this going to work? So the best thing to do is put some stakes in the ground that can bring your expectations into focus so you're achieving your goals rather than just being disappointed in what you can't do. So I put 2 stakes in the ground. I wanted to get to Denali and travel on the train either there or back. And this restricted my choices, right? And it allowed me to focus on what I could succeed at. I didn't have to worry about all the other areas of the state. I knew I was making my way along that tourist through line to Denali and back again, and that allowed me just to focus. So I did my research in 2 ways. One, people are going to understand, and the other people are going to say, wow, that's an old school way of doing it. So the old school way is, I still actually use Lonely Planet travel guides. I know people are going to say, Ian, the internet exists. Why are you using Lonely Planet travel guides? But there is a good reason. To me, the Lonely Planet travel guides provide a well-curated and presented way of understanding the whole, right? I got an appreciation of the whole of Alaska from reading the Lonely Planet guide. I use the internet's full power to read travel blogs, watch YouTube videos, and the miraculous thing of being able to plan locally. I mean, I find it absolutely amazing, right? That you can look at websites that allow you to meticulously plan your bus journeys in Southeast Asia from the comfort of your own home. The trouble is, the internet presents information as a very orchestrated experience of what someone else did. So combining the internet with the Lonely Travel guides means I can avoid just doing what someone else did and take in the whole, but also appreciate what I'm finding on the internet in that context. So that's why I do both. And I highly recommend it, that I do understand that some generations have an aversion to the printed word. Okay, so do you need a car? Well, the answer to this is obviously yes and no, right? I didn't need a car, and I was happy I didn't take one. But I'm going to explain why. I utilised the park connection buses, specifically the park-to-park route schedule, to get to Denali. I didn't miss not having a car in this case, but that's because I was doing sort of a direct trip through to Denali. And I was getting the train back. So it's not like I needed the car for the return trip. So I didn't miss it. If you were organising your holiday differently, car would be useful. So if your adventure was different and you were travelling to different hubs and staying there for several days and doing adventures out of those hubs, a bit like what me and Jack did in Canadian Rockies, right? Then I would advocate having a car. But since I was basically doing quite a fast-paced trip along a straight road, pretty much, to Denali and getting the train back, I didn't miss the car. So some people might ask, why didn't I tag a land portion that was organised by my cruise company onto my cruise? And it's certainly true that some cruise companies allow you to do that, and so does Norwegian. And these have significant advantages. I mean, they're all organised by the cruise company. They take care of your luggage, which can be a big thing if you've bought a lot of cruise luggage, right? And some cruise companies do this so much. For example, Princess. They actually own hotels outside Denali to facilitate those tours. Now, I chose not to do that, though I did look into it. And the primary reason I didn't do it was I just couldn't get a combination, an itinerary combination that was organised by the cruise ship that I liked. So I just backed off it. I'd also say people were complaining that they'd been dumped by their cruise company on a land tour that they didn't fully understand. You know, I'd say it was quite frequent. There was a vibe on my cruise, and certainly from people on other cruises when I met them on land, that they were actually quite confused by their land tour. So, you know, that may give me a misrepresented opinion of cruise land tours, but I was glad I did mine independently. Okay, so what actually was my itinerary? Let's pin down the facts, right? So, as we'd established, the focus was getting to Denali and taking the train there or the train back. So it was an exercise in organising the transport, the hotels, and any tours along the way. So here it is, right? Day one, I arrived in Seaward by cruise ship early in the morning, and I stayed there. I did a tour on that day. On day two, at 10:20 a.m, I travelled to Talkeetna via Anchorage, arriving at 17:30 p.m. Day three, I left Talkeetna, but not till 17:45 p.m. obviously. And during that day, I did my flight over the Denali Mountains. I arrived at Denali National Park at 8:30 p.m. Then in day four, I had a day in Denali National Park and did my tour into the national park itself. Day five, I travelled back to Anchorage via the Alaska Railroad, and then day six, I started my journey home. So you'll notice the itinerary of the land adventure is very compact. It's a lot more compact than what I'd normally do. Initially, I was trying to do a more spread out version where I spent 2 nights in every location, you know, Seaward, Talkeetna, and then 3 nights in Denali. But it didn't survive, to some extent due to cost. And then to some extent, I felt I was sort of like, I don't know, overcooking it. Ultimately, I didn't regret the compacted itinerary, and it proved to be the best thing for this style of trip for a few reasons, right? The trip was tour-based, so there's definitely an element of getting to a place, doing your tours, and then moving on. I also wanted to keep my return flights with one airline, which did, you know, set my return to Anchorage to certain set dates. So there was that going on as well. I just felt it was safer, everything being under one airline. And sometimes you literally don't need to spend a lot of time in some of these places. For example, if the Park Connection buses were running the Denali Express route, I may have chosen to arrive in Talkeetna in the morning and leave in the same day in the evening and get my flight tour in between the 2 buses. And the other thing to consider is that hotels are extortionate. This is why I was saying, you know, I said it on my cruise planning video, which went out at the same time as this one. The cruise per night was peanuts compared to the $300 per night at some of these hotels you stay at in Alaska. So all the travel was booked through Alaska Tour and Travel, which I'll link to in the description. I mean, I happened to find them because each time I tried to book a Park Connection bus, it seemed to go through to them. I don't know if they own the Park Connection buses or whether they're just such a frequent booker that they always come up first. And as I investigated further, it was just as easy for me to book the Alaskan Railroad with them as well. If I'd have really thought about it, I then should have just booked my hotel with them as well, but I didn't think about that at the time. So I booked the hotels on specific days myself. I booked the Talkeetna Alaska Lodge and the Denali Bluff hotels directly, and all of my other hotels in Vancouver and Seaward were via Expedia. I tend to like Expedia if I can do that, because they often have quite friendly cancellation policies. It allows you to book something while really looking for something else, right? What I never thought of until I was making my way through Alaska was I could have just used Alaska Touring and Travel to book everything and then have one point of failure. But I didn't really realise that until I got there. The Talkeetna Lodge, takes some pronunciation, and Denali Bluff hotels, I mean, these are cheap. They have the sort of exclusive feeling combined with a weird independently owned and strange design choices vibe. You get these sorts of hotels a lot in mountain locations. It was also true in Banff, where they're expensive. They have some extent an outward sense of luxury, but then you'll get to your room and it's like all sorts of weird arcane choices of yesteryear. So they're a bit like that. I mean, I enjoyed staying in both. I view it as part of the experience, but they are expensive for what you get, and you're definitely paying for the location. So again, budget for excursions, just like the cruise, especially along this Denali road through line to the national park. These tours are not cheap, especially when you start to factor in helicopters and small prop planes. I mean, I'm sure that parts of Alaska are as accessible as, say, the Canadian Rockies, where you can drive up to where you can drive up to the hiking head car park and off into the mountains. I'm sure there's parts of Alaska that are maybe like that. But on the route to Denali and back, you always feel like the mountains are two things, either very distant from you. It still looked picturesque because of the vastness of Alaska, right? I'm not complaining, it wasn't glorious. But the mountains themselves always feel quite distant, right? So to actually experience the mountains, you're going on tours. So I did a Kenai Fjords National Park glacier and wildlife cruise in Seward. I mean, that was amazing. I would highly recommend that. In Talkeetna, I did my flight tour over the mountains. As I said, it's the only real way to get close to them, unless you're doing what some crazy people were doing on my bus to Denali, climbing it. They had all the gear. I was like, wow. And then finally, I did the Tundra Wilderness Tour in Denali itself. All of these have a cost. I mean, the flight tour was 200 quid on up. So I didn't actually book that until I got to the Talkeetna Lodge because I was and ahhing on whether to do it. But K2, who I went with, are great. They will assess the weather, see if they can do your flight. If they can't do your flight, they'll rearrange it in the same day. If they can't do your flight but can do a slightly degraded one, they'll put you on the lesser option because that one can happen. I mean, K2 were absolutely fantastic, and so was the flight, but it is quite expensive, but well worth it. The other thing that was fascinating about my land adventure is when using the park connection buses from Seward to Denali, you stop in Anchorage to change buses. And this gives you an opportunity to talk to your fellow passengers. And what became immediately obvious is a whole bunch of us were on precisely the same itinerary. We just booked it either independently or different travel agents, but ended up with the same itinerary. And this is when it occurred to me that I could have just booked everything with Alaska Tours and Travel, right? I had no idea this would be the case, but it makes perfect sense, as there's only so many combinations that can be done when you're going to Denali one way and coming back on the train. So this meant I was effectively on a group tour with a load of people who'd booked it independently, right down to being on the same tour in Denali, right down to getting on the same K2 flight to fly over the mountains. Now this actually proved brilliant. And I know, look, I would not book a small group tour holiday. I just don't think I'd ever do that. But because it happened serendipitously and people were just moving in and out from each other and enjoying the fact that we kept bumping into the same people rather than just feeling like we were like, hi, here's the 20 people you're going to be with for the next 7 days. It was fantastic. So since I was undergoing constant movement and wasn't on a cruise organised land tour, I had to be very clever with my baggage, right? I only wanted to take a small case and a backpack. I did this by restricting myself to carry-on luggage. And my carry-on suitcase was actually smaller than I could have taken, And my 100 Provoke backpack can count as, you know, my personal item. This would have been easier if I never took my hiking boots, but, you know, better safe than sorry. So in terms of packing for Alaska, there is videos that can give you all sorts of advice, but I just say pack like you're going hiking, right? So this means layers of waterproof, shoes that are at least water resistant, and then you can add layers, take layers off. Simple as that. Since I essentially was sort of going hiking on my land portion, it made it sensible for me to do that. But I would say even if you're just doing a cruise, that's how you should pack. Things you should avoid are a winter coat. Maybe that's a British thing. You know, the winter coat. This big thick coat that's annoying. Just layers and a waterproof, right? And then also denim and cotton. The reason you avoid denim and cotton, hikers will be aware of this, but is because it holds water, that water cools down, and before long, you're really cold. So hiking key is just the way to go, because it's quick drying, right, like this, or your trousers are probably water repellent. Just do that. So would I change anything? So the only really thing I'd change is how I booked my K2 flight. I booked it through the Talkeetna Lodge, then cancelled it through the Talkeetna Lodge, and then as the weather changed, I went to the K2 office in Talkeetna and booked another one. You know, and they said, no, you've not got any other one booked, right? But then I got a credit card charge from the Talkeetna Lodge, and that ended up in a long and extensive dispute with my credit card company. So, I mean, do whatever you want, but that taught me just book direct. Yeah, don't involve multiple participants. Personally, I'd not do this itinerary again in a longer or shorter form, but that's primarily because I've already done it, right? If I was to go to Alaska again, I'd probably seek to do what we did in the Canadian Rockies and move around a bit more. And stopping in hubs and doing adventures out of those hubs and then moving on maybe after every 2 or 3 days or so. If I went to Alaska again, that's probably how I'd do it. I would also consider a cruise, especially cruising in or out of Alaska, as there are places you won't get to see if you just fly in on land and fly out on land, right? If you want to see how I planned my cruise to Seward, which is where I started my land portion of this trip, then you can check out the video on screen now.